In this video, we delve into the rising tensions between China and Russia, particularly as President Xi Jinping issues a stern warning to Vladimir Putin about the use of nuclear weapons in the ongoing war in Ukraine. As Russia faces increasing challenges on the battlefield, Beijing fears that Moscow may escalate the conflict in a way that could have catastrophic global consequences. Join us as we explore how China's once solid alliance with Russia is being tested, and what this means for the future of global stability. In recent years, the geopolitical landscape has shifted dramatically, with alliances and rivalries evolving in unexpected ways. One of the most surprising developments is the growing tension between China and Russia, two countries that, for much of the last decade, have portrayed themselves as strong allies against Western influence. However, behind the scenes, things aren't as rosy as they seem, and the world is beginning to see cracks in this so-called no-limits partnership, especially as the war in Ukraine drags on. Today, we're going to dive deep into how China's relationship with Russia is being strained, particularly around the critical issue of nuclear weapons. President Xi Jinping of China has reportedly issued a stern warning to Vladimir Putin, telling him that under no circumstances should Russia resort to using nuclear weapons in the ongoing conflict with Ukraine. Now, the idea of China babysitting Russia might seem bizarre given their historical partnership, but that's exactly what's happening. China, as a global superpower with massive economic interests, has every reason to fear the escalation of the war into a nuclear one. As the situation in Ukraine intensifies and Russia struggles to secure victories, Beijing is getting increasingly worried that Moscow may push things too far. China's message to Putin is clear. A nuclear war is not in anyone's best interest, least of all China's. And if Putin defies Xi's warnings, the consequences could be disastrous, not just for Russia, but for the entire world. To understand why China is so adamant about preventing Russia from using nuclear weapons, it's important to look at the current state of affairs between the two nations and the broader geopolitical picture. Russia has been growing increasingly desperate as its war in Ukraine continues to falter. Ukrainian forces have been remarkably successful in retaking territory, and the West is edging closer to allowing Ukraine to use its weapons inside Russian territory. Putin, feeling backed into a corner, has responded with escalating rhetoric, repeatedly threatening to use nuclear weapons as a means of deterring further Western involvement. This isn't just a bluff either. The rhetoric has been accompanied by real, tangible actions. There are reports of construction happening around nuclear warhead storage facilities in Russia, and intelligence sources have observed the buildup of infrastructure necessary for the deployment of nuclear missiles. Satellite imagery has shown potential launch sites for nuclear missiles being developed, and analysts are beginning to question whether these warnings are more than just words. For China, this is terrifying. Nuclear war is not just a threat to Russia and Ukraine, it's a threat to the entire world. Beijing has always been clear about its stance on nuclear weapons. They are a last resort, to be used only in the direst of circumstances, if at all. China's position has always been that nuclear weapons should serve defensive purposes, not be used as a tool for intimidation or escalation. From Beijing's perspective, the use of nuclear weapons would not only destroy Russia's remaining global standing, but also drag China into a conflict that it has worked hard to avoid. China's economy is deeply interconnected with global markets, and the ripple effects of a nuclear war would be catastrophic. The global economy would likely collapse, supply chains would be disrupted, and millions, perhaps billions of people would suffer. For China, which is trying to position itself as a responsible global leader, this scenario is unacceptable. One of the fascinating dynamics at play here is China's attempt to balance its relationship with Russia while maintaining some degree of neutrality in the eyes of the world. On the one hand, China has a vested interest in supporting Russia as a counterbalance to Western influence, particularly the United States. Both countries have long viewed NATO's expansion as a threat, and Beijing shares Moscow's concerns about Western encroachment on their spheres of influence. However, China is also acutely aware of the importance of its relationships with the West. The United States, Japan, and European Union countries are all key trading partners, and China cannot afford to alienate them completely. This is why, even as China has maintained its no-limits partnership with Russia, it has been careful not to explicitly endorse Putin's actions in Ukraine. Beijing has repeatedly called for peace talks and a political resolution to the conflict, while at the same time refusing to condemn Russia's invasion outright. This delicate balancing act has become increasingly difficult to maintain as the war drags on. Western leaders have accused China of indirectly supporting Russia's war effort by providing dual-use goods that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. Beijing has denied these accusations, insisting that it is merely supplying regular goods to Russia and not engaging in any activities that would violate international sanctions. However, the optics of this situation are damning. To many in the West, China's refusal to fully condemn Russia is seen as tacit support for Putin's war. So, what happens if Putin ignores Xi's warnings and decides to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? The consequences would be dire, to say the least. Even a limited use of tactical nuclear weapons, small-scale nuclear devices designed to target military objectives rather than entire cities, would likely provoke a massive global response. NATO has made it clear that any use of nuclear weapons would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict, and Western powers would likely retaliate in some form. China, for its part, would find itself in an impossible position. On the one hand, it has a deep-seated interest in preventing nuclear escalation, but on the other, it has staked a significant portion of its foreign policy on its relationship with Russia. If Russia crosses this red line, Beijing may be forced to distance itself from Moscow to preserve its standing on the global stage. This would represent a major fracture in the China-Russia relationship, one that could have far-reaching consequences for the future of global geopolitics. There's also the possibility that a nuclear strike could trigger a wider conflict, dragging more countries into the war. NATO's involvement would almost certainly escalate, and other nuclear powers, including China, would be forced to reconsider their positions. The risk of miscalculation would skyrocket, and before long, we could find ourselves on the brink of a full-scale nuclear war. This is precisely the scenario that Xi Jinping is trying to avoid. He understands that a nuclear war would be a disaster for China, Russia, and the rest of the world. Even if China itself were not directly targeted, the fallout, both literal and metaphorical, would devastate the global economy, disrupt trade, and potentially trigger a worldwide recession. For a country that relies so heavily on international trade, this would be catastrophic. As we look ahead, it's clear that the relationship between China and Russia is at a crossroads. While Beijing and Moscow have long presented themselves as allies united against the West, the reality is far more complicated. China's priorities are global in nature, and while it values its partnership with Russia, it is not willing to sacrifice its broader interests for the sake of supporting Putin's increasingly reckless actions. The war in Ukraine has placed China in a difficult position, and the longer it drags on, the harder it will be for Beijing to maintain its balancing act. At some point, China may be forced to choose between its relationship with Russia and its standing in the international community. If Putin continues to push the nuclear envelope, that choice may come sooner rather than later. One thing is certain, China's warnings to Russia are not just diplomatic posturing. Xi Jinping understands the gravity of the situation, and he is doing everything in his power to prevent a nuclear catastrophe. Whether or not Putin listens remains to be seen, but the stakes couldn't be higher. In the end, this is about more than just the war in Ukraine. It's about the future of global stability, and whether or not the world's great powers can avoid a conflict that would make all of our other problems, climate change, economic inequality, political polarization, seem trivial by comparison. Let's hope that cooler heads prevail and that Xi's warnings to Putin are heeded before it's too late.